A black woman quietly walked into the airport she secretly owned, just trying to catch a flight, but what happened next stunned everyone. A TSA agent humiliated her, ripped open her suitcase, and dumped out her late grandmother's jewelry in front of a crowd. He thought she was just another traveler. But 7 hours later, he was being escorted out by security, jobless and speechless. What did she do next? It didn't just change the airport, it sparked a wave of justice no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is one of those stories that proves karma always lands. Before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? And if this story moves you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. It's time people saw what dignity looks like under pressure. The airport buzzed with that old, familiar promise of departure, of transformation. And yet, in this America, there are places you pass through that do not let you forget who you are, no matter how much you've become. Her name was Aurelia Stanton, a woman who had crafted her success from scraps, made grace from pressure, and arrived not just at the airport, but at a station in life few imagined for someone who looked like her. She was dressed plainly, but every line of her stance spoke of poise. A pearl-white blouse and navy trousers hugged a frame built not just of ambition, but of memory, of inheritance. Trinity Bay International was hers now, or at least, hers in ways that made paperwork and capital bow. She had acquired a stake so substantial in the airport's latest redevelopment that in corporate rooms, her name carried the weight of policy. But that morning, she walked through those sliding glass doors like anybody else, wheeling behind her a Samsonite suitcase and a sense of quiet purpose. Now, there is something peculiar about security lines. They flatten us, force a kind of democracy by cue. But not all bodies are read the same in this democracy. Aurelia knew that. The beeping machines didn't frighten her. Neither did the metal tables nor the latex gloves. What struck her as soon as she stepped into line was the look. That brief, narrow squint from the man in uniform, Agent Daryl McKean, that called into question not her identity, but her legitimacy. A flicker of suspicion disguised as vigilance. A look that black people have known since before airports, before borders. A look that said, "You may walk here, but you do not belong." She watched him. Noted how he breezed through scanning the items of others, how his tone warmed for suits and softened for smiles. But with her, he waited. Watched. He wanted something. Not an answer, but a mistake. When her turn came, she greeted him with the same civility she'd offer anyone else. "Good morning." He did not return it. Only stared at her ID longer than necessary. Compared her face to the photo like he was looking for proof that both did not match. Then he motioned her through the scanner with a grunt. Step to the side. Random check. The word random in America has a strange way of targeting the same people again and again. Aurelia said nothing. She had faced far worse in boardrooms full of men who smiled at her with teeth sharp as laws. She moved aside. At that moment, the air thickened. Travelers pretended not to notice, though their eyes betrayed them. Some looked relieved not to be chosen. Others looked ashamed. The silence hummed with a familiar tune. Let her be calm, let her not make a scene. What they did not know, what Daryl certainly did not know, was who she was. But that didn't matter yet. The search began with gloves and pats. Then it escalated. Her suitcase opened like a wound. Shirts pulled apart, documents flung, a velvet pouch, the last heirlooms of her grandmother, spilled open like loose change. And still she said nothing. Because Aurelia understood something too many people still do not. When you carry black skin through this country, dignity is something you often have to protect more fiercely than your belongings. She knew that the cameras were rolling. She knew this moment was bigger than just inconvenience. It was about the questions still unasked, the assumptions still undisturbed. It was about the performance of suspicion and the blindness of power. And so, she let him finish. Let him show everyone exactly what he believed about her. Because soon, they would all learn who she was. Aurelia walked away slowly, like a woman who had just buried something sacred. And in many ways, she had. She gathered her grandmother's jewelry with trembling fingers, each chain and bracelet once warmed by the hands of a woman who had worked kitchens and cleaned houses so her granddaughter might someday fly. And yet, even at 40, with wealth in her name and power in her stride, Aurelia had just been reminded, some people will never see the wings, only the skin. She made her way toward the gate with her back straight, but her spirit bruised. There's a difference between pain and surprise. She wasn't surprised. No, the offense was older than her, older than McKean's sneer, older than the checkpoint. It was embedded in the carpet of American institutions. What stung, even now, was how unshaken the system remained. The people who looked on and said nothing. The woman who patted her down but dared not speak. The terminal's air was chilled, overconditioned, sterile, designed to erase differences. But for the black traveler, there is no such erasure. The world insists you carry your identity like a flag and a warning, all at once. As she sat waiting at the gate, she pulled out her phone. Emails, press requests, meeting confirmations. Her assistant had already texted, "Did everything go smoothly this morning?" Aurelia didn't reply. What could she say that would explain the quiet violence of being stripped, not of your possessions, but of your presumption to belong? That's the thing they don't talk about in schools or newspapers, how racism rarely raises its voice anymore. It wears a badge, it wields a clipboard, it asks questions with a smile. And then it dares you to call it by name. A white man seated nearby glanced at her suitcase, still slightly ajar. He looked away when her eyes met his. That's the trouble, isn't it? The discomfort isn't in the injustice, it's in being forced to see it. The boarding call sounded. Group 1, please proceed to the gate. She stood and rolled forward. The gate agent, a younger white woman with too much makeup and too little grace, paused. Ma'am, first class is boarding now. Aurelia's ticket was already in her hand. She held it out. I am first class. The woman blinked, looked down at the pass, then up again, smiled too brightly. Oh, my mistake. No, it wasn't. And both women knew it. But Aurelia didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that being polite in the face of prejudice isn't a concession. It's a form of protest. A way of saying, you may question me, but you cannot define me. Once aboard the plane, she settled into her seat by the window. She had chosen it deliberately. She liked seeing how small the world looked from above. But there was no shrinking the truth. Not from this altitude. Because even up here, 30,000 feet above the asphalt and outrage, the weight of history buckled the floor beneath her. The flight attendant came by. Blonde, thin-lipped. Her name tag read Becca. Would you like a drink before takeoff? Aurelia asked for water. Becca poured it into a plastic cup, no lemon, no napkin. She passed it without a word and moved on. The white man beside Aurelia ordered bourbon. He got 2 napkins and a joke. Some folks will tell you these things are small, petty, that you're imagining them. That if you just don't mention race, maybe it won't exist. But old folks know better. They remember when the insult was shouted. Now it's whispered, etched into the pauses, delivered in the tilt of a head, the delay in a smile, the doubt behind a compliment. The plane lifted off. Aurelia stared out the window as clouds swept below. She could still feel the TSA agent's gloved hands pulling at her dignity. She wondered if the supervisor would ever review the footage, if anyone cared. But deep down, she wasn't waiting for an apology. She knew that power rarely repents, it resists. It protects itself. And still, she intended to confront it. Because the difference between surviving and living is the courage to say, this is not enough. And she had come too far to whisper now. The flight was barely airborne when Aurelia realized she hadn't escaped the ground at all. The clouds, white and blameless, stretched across the window like a dream no black woman could afford. She stared out past them, but her mind remained rooted in the terminal, where strangers had stood by and watched her humiliation as though they were watching weather pass, certain it would never touch them. Her neighbor in seat 2C coughed, adjusted his collar, and offered a curt nod. He had the look of an old executive, silver temples, expensive watch, confidence soaked in comfort. He didn't recognize her. Or maybe he did, and chose not to. She didn't care. The thing about being a Black woman in first class is this: every new seat feels like borrowed time. Even after the ticket is paid, even after the flight's confirmed, the seatbelt never quite fastens around your belongings. The captain's voice crackled overhead. "We'd like to welcome you aboard. Flight time to Charlotte is approximately 1 hour and 5 minutes. Becca, the flight attendant, returned with a tray of warmed nuts and drinks. "Anything else, Mr. Delacroix?" she asked the man beside her. He smiled. "Just the usual." "Thanks, Becca." She turned to Aurelia, her tone sharpening. "Would you like something else?" Aurelia glanced at the tray. "The same bourbon. The same napkin. I'll take what he's having." There was a pause. A small one, but long enough to say everything. Becca blinked. "Of course." She poured, wordless. No napkin again. Aurelia took the drink. Sipped. Let it sit heavy on her tongue like the history of every refusal masked as a misunderstanding. It was always like this. Not the grand lynching or the burning cross. Not anymore. It was subtler now. Polished. It arrived in the omission. The extra screening. The misplaced tone. The narrowed eyes behind a smile. It was the art of exclusion perfected into routine. And for people who had lived long enough to see water fountains once labeled colored, the modern version was no less bitter, just better dressed. Aurelia reached into her bag and pulled out her leather notebook. Inside it were pages of names, numbers, land deeds, documents from a pending business deal that had the power to reshape her holdings. But as she thumbed through them, her mind wandered again to the TSA agent, McKenna. The way he'd rifled through her things like she had no right to privacy. No right to silence. No right to carry memories in peace. She jotted a note. Harassment from within the house I own. Then paused. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? She owned part of the airport. Her name was etched into the structure, buried in boardroom contracts and investment portfolios. And yet they searched for her like a thief. Because it was never about what you owned. It was about who they believed you to be. The plane hit a bump of turbulence. Her bourbon trembled. She held it steady. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw Mr. Delacroix studying her. Not with menace, but with something more dangerous, curiosity cloaked in condescension. "Are you traveling for business?" he asked. Aurelia didn't flinch. "Always." He chuckled, as if amused by the idea. "The country's come a long way, huh?" She set down her glass. "Long enough for folks to pretend we started at the same line." He blinked, not quite sure how to receive that. "Well," he offered, "it's certainly different now. I mean, look at you. Look at you." The words sat in the air like smoke from a slow fire. Aurelia met his gaze with a smile as tight as a clenched fist. "Yes," she said softly. "Look at me. But make sure you see." And that was the moment he turned away, just slightly, enough to say he'd seen more than he wanted. The rest of the flight passed in silence. But for Aurelia, it wasn't quiet. The air was thick with unspoken rules, invisible walls, and all the little ways the world still tried to remind her where it thought she belonged. She didn't need their reminders. She had her own. And once she landed, she would begin to remind them. Charlotte greeted Aurelia with the same polished indifference most American cities reserve for Black women who arrive carrying both purpose and memory. The airport, bigger than Trinity Bay but smaller than Atlanta, was humming, polished tile, sterile lights, soft classical music playing through overhead speakers as though culture alone could mask something deeper. She disembarked quickly, heels clicking against the floor with the assurance of someone who had long ago decided never to apologize for her presence. A car waited to take her downtown. The driver, a young man with a military haircut and a name badge that said Ben, didn't speak much. When he did, it was to confirm the address. But as he opened the door for her, his eyes flicked to her suitcase, then to her face, then back again. Like he was still trying to solve a math problem that didn't add up. Aurelia gave him nothing. Just a smile that said, "I've already seen the answer." The meeting that afternoon was set in a marble and glass tower, a place where deals are made over still water and unsalted almonds. Aurelia had been here before. Not this building, not the city, but this space. The room that looks modern, smells expensive, and stares at her like she's the only person who forgot to wear a name tag. She walked in with her assistant, Lyle, a sharp-minded brother from Newark who knew how to carry a briefcase and a threat in the same hand. They took the elevator to the 23rd floor. The firm's name was etched in gold across the glass wall. Inside, 4 men waited. 2 white, 1 Indian, and 1 who might have passed for black if he didn't insist on outwhiting the rest. The handshakes were dry, the smiles polished, and the conversation immediate. "Aurelia, thank you for making the trip," said the man in the gray checkered suit. His name was Clay. Of course it was Clay. She nodded. "Happy to be here. Shall we begin?" And so they began. But not before Clay made an offhand comment. "I must say," he chuckled, "you're not quite what I expected from an airport executive." Aurelia tilted her head. "What exactly were you expecting?" Clay laughed awkwardly. "Oh, someone a bit more bureaucratic." Lyle shifted in his seat. Aurelia smiled. "I see. Well, I've learned that expectations rarely serve anyone but the person doing the expecting." There was a beat of silence. Then the numbers started. The charts. The proposals. The jargon-laced language that men like Clay used to wrap themselves in legitimacy. But all through it, Aurelia felt it. The subtle test. The long-held assumption that she was lucky to be in the room, that perhaps she hadn't built her wealth but borrowed it, inherited it, or married it. She had seen this dance before. It didn't matter how clear her profit margins were, or how refined her portfolio is. There would always be someone sitting across the table trying to decipher her presence like it was an accident in motion. Still, she remained composed. Professional. But she noticed how they asked Lyle to fetch more water. How they questioned her numbers but accepted the consultants. How they called her Miss Stanton with that extra weight, like her name didn't quite belong on their tongues. By the end of the meeting, the deal was still moving forward. But not without scars. As they stepped into the elevator, Lyle finally exhaled. "They always say the quiet parts out loud, don't they?" he muttered. Aurelia pressed the button for the lobby. "Sometimes it's not what they say," she replied. "It's what they never have to say." Because the room was built to agree with them. They exited into the hallway and walked slowly through the lobby. It was beautiful. Wide, grand, full of art meant to evoke unity. An installation of linked hands made from bronze hung from the ceiling. A quote from Maya Angelou was carved into the wall, her words floating above marble floors as a kind of performance. And yet, just minutes before, a black woman's qualifications had been doubted in the shadow of her own success. Aurelia paused beneath the sculpture. "America loves to put our faces on the wall," she whispered. "But it still flinches when we sit at the table." Lyle looked at her. "You want to head back to the airport?" "No," she said. "I want to walk a little." She stepped outside, letting the southern sun touch her face. Because sometimes a black woman has to walk, so she doesn't lose her mind in a world that still debates whether she's allowed to sit. When Aurelia returned to Trinity Bay that evening, the sky had already begun its quiet descent into dusk. The airport lights flickered on in sequence, illuminating the tarmac like a theater stage waiting for the next act. And in many ways, that's exactly what it was, a performance that began the moment the first traveler crossed the automatic doors. She had just enough time to stop by the admin wing before heading to her suite on the airport grounds. But before she could reach her office, a familiar voice intercepted her. "Miss Stanton, may I have a word?" It was Martin Delgado, head of security, Latino, mid-50s, with a weary kindness in his eyes. He held a clipboard in one hand, the other tucked awkwardly in his waistband. She gestured toward her door. Of course. Come in. Inside, Martin didn't sit. He hovered like a man caught between duty and discomfort. It's about your presence at security, he began. There's been murmurs. Aurelia arched her brow. Murmurs? Martin shifted his stance. Some staff say it creates tension. That when you go through security like a regular passenger, it complicates things. She leaned against her desk. Are they saying my presence is the problem? Or is it the fact that they're being watched when they forget I'm not invisible? Martin hesitated. It's not everyone, but a few agents feel like they're walking on eggshells. Maybe they should ask themselves why the floor's so fragile, she replied sharply. I'm not walking through security to make a point. I'm walking through because I own the floor, and I'm watching the people who were hired to stand on it. Martin cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. One of them, the younger ones, said it might help if we could issue you a diplomatic bypass badge. Quietly. No need to go through the line. She narrowed her eyes. So let me understand this. The solution to racial discomfort is for the black woman to disappear from sight. He swallowed. It's just a suggestion. For efficiency. Aurelia stood upright. For years, we've been asked to go around, not through. To enter from the back, to smile when we bleed, to make it easy for folks who never learned how to sit beside us. If I vanish now, what does that teach the ones coming behind me? Martin looked chastened. I didn't mean offense. I know, she said softly. But that's the problem, isn't it? Offense doesn't always come with intent. Sometimes it's built into the architecture. She turned toward the window, staring out at the distant control tower. The whole place ran on visibility, cameras, screens, schedules, and yet somehow she was being told she was too visible. That her presence disrupted the flow. That night, after Martin left, she received an email from the city's aviation board. Polite, deferential, and still somehow off. It welcomed her to an upcoming forum on regional transportation equity, requested her input, and then a line that chilled her. We believe your unique perspective as a woman of color brings important optics to the discussion. Optics. Not vision. Not leadership. Not experience. She closed her laptop slowly. In the shadows of progress, the language always changed before the behavior did. The next morning, she arrived at the TSA checkpoint again. Not in protest. Not to prove anything. Simply to exist. Like every traveler. But this time, something had shifted. The agents were polite, excessively so. One even called her ma'am with a tremble in his voice. It was not respect, it was fear wrapped in professionalism. She passed through the scanner without incident. But as she picked up her bag, she heard the unmistakable tone of a voice behind her. Random search. It was the same phrase. The same cadence. But it was directed at someone else this time, a young black man, early 20s, traveling alone. He looked startled. Confused. She saw it in his eyes, the silent math of why me? She paused, turned around, watched. The agent, a woman this time, seemed to flinch under her gaze. But I continued. Aurelia took a breath, and for the first time, stepped out of the line and walked toward the search area. She didn't interfere, didn't flash her badge, didn't invoke her title. She simply stood nearby, watching, waiting. The message was clear. If you see me, you behave differently. Then maybe I'll stand right here. Until you learn how to behave when I'm not. The boardroom at Trinity Bay sat on the 11th floor, glass-walled and high enough that planes appeared to float like silverfish beyond the window panes. Inside, the room was clean, sterile almost, leather chairs, polished wood, air conditioning cold enough to keep tempers from boiling too quickly. Aurelia Stanton stood near the head of the table, flipping through a set of prepared notes. The room slowly filled with executives, consultants, a city liaison or two. All invited. All notified. Yet, as the meeting came to order, something less visible arrived as well, Resistance dressed in civility. It came not in shouting or slurs. No, this racism wore a tailored suit, carried a spreadsheet, and nodded when you spoke before moving to disregard what you said in the vote. This meeting was about regional expansion, Trinity Bay's first proposal to offer direct international service. The numbers were strong. The logistics sound. Aurelia had spent months drafting this proposal, aligning her vision with not just profit, but community uplift, new jobs, new internships, a Black-owned contracting firm ready to build out the customs wing. Yet when she finished her clear, articulate pitch, silence greeted her. Then came the cough, followed by the first objection. "Well, Miss Stanton," said Mr. Eldridge, a man with salt-white hair, deep Texas vowels, and a fondness for addressing grown women like they were his niece, "we certainly appreciate your enthusiasm. But this is quite the ambitious plan." Aurelia offered a neutral smile. "Ambition is the only thing that's ever built anything worth keeping, Mr. Eldridge." He chuckled. Sure. But bringing in international carriers, revamping customs, local hiring quotas, it's a lot. And frankly, we have to think about the airport's image." There it was. That word again. Image. It was always about image. Not efficient. Not an opportunity. Not the truth. Always optics. Another board member chimed in, this one younger, sharper, but no less slippery. "You're suggesting we partner with several small Black-owned construction firms for Phase 1. Can they really handle a project of this scale?" Aurelia leaned forward, her voice even. "They've handled builds larger than this. You just haven't worked with them." Yet, someone cleared their throat. Papers shuffled. The sound of discomfort masquerading as deliberation. In that moment, Aurelia realized what the room was actually voting on. Her credibility. Not the project's feasibility. Not the metrics. But her right to decide what direction this airport flew in. They didn't say it outright. But it pulsed beneath every deferral. That unspoken belief, she got lucky. She bought her way in. But now she's trying to change too much. Too fast. Too black. She could feel it in the way they avoided her gaze when she pressed for commitment. The way their voices lowered when quoting neutral concerns. These men had sat in this room for years. They'd seen mediocre ideas sail through when they were signed by the familiar hand of a white man. Now they were faced with excellence that came in a form they still mistrusted. One man leaned back and crossed his arms. "Let's table the vote for now. We can review the proposal more closely and reconvene next quarter." That was code for, "Let it die quietly." Aurelia looked out the window at the planes rising like prayers. Then back at the table. "No," she said. Calm, not angry. "We're not tabling this. We're voting today. Because delay is denial dressed up for polite company. And I've seen that costume party before." Several faces stiffened. One woman, a junior consultant, lowered her eyes, lips tightening into the kind of pained smile that says, "I know what you're saying, but I can't say it, too." The silence stretched. Then Martin Delgado, sitting in the corner as airport security rep, cleared his throat. "I've reviewed the operational plan," he said. "Logistically, it's solid. And from a safety standpoint, we're prepared for international routing. If this doesn't pass, it won't be because it's not feasible." That was the crack Aurelia needed. She seized it. The data is here. The need is here. The opportunity is now, she said, her voice steady but rising. "I won't ask you to approve this because I'm the owner. I'm asking because I've done the work. And if you're still unsure after reading all of this, then I suggest you ask yourselves why." Another pause. Then, slowly, one hand raised. Then another. Then one more. It wasn't unanimous. But the vote passed. Just barely. Enough to move forward. Enough to breathe. But not enough to forget. That night, back in her quiet office, Aurelia sat alone. The city sparkled below. Her notes lay scattered, the cost of persuasion etched into every margin. She thought of her father, how he'd been denied a bank loan 3 times to open a barbershop on the South Side, how he kept cutting hair in his living room until someone finally saw his worth. She had inherited his skill with blades, only hers cut through glass ceilings. Still, she was tired. Not broken. But I'm tired. Because every room she entered still required her to prove she belonged. Even when she built the damn room. It began with a luncheon. A corporate formality dressed up in shrimp cocktail and linen napkins, the kind where everyone wears their best smile but no one listens too deeply. It was hosted at the Liberty Club downtown, an old money fortress whose dark wood walls and black and white photographs told a story of who had always belonged and who had only recently arrived. Aurelia Stanton was seated 3 chairs from the head of the table. The placement was intentional, close enough to be visible, far enough to remain peripheral. These men, and it was mostly men, knew how to make someone feel included without granting them true proximity to power. They were there to celebrate Trinity Bay's international expansion. But this gathering wasn't about celebration. It was about inspection. Aurelia knew it the moment she walked in and was greeted with a chorus of "You must be the lady who owns the place now," and didn't expect to see a sister running aviation. They meant it as a compliment. As if the surprise alone was generous. As if astonishment was praise. Aurelia didn't flinch. She never did. She let their condescension roll off her polished blouse like raindrops on marble. But inside, the temperature was rising. She spoke clearly and briefly when the chairman asked her to give remarks. Her words were measured, her delivery exact. She talked about infrastructure, job growth, efficiency. She talked about community investment. About equity, not just access, but ownership. A few clapped. 1 or 2 nodded. But she saw the exchange of glances down the table, the small smirks, the flicker of a wink from one man to another, as if to say, "She rehearsed that well, didn't she?" Afterward, as guests mingled over coffee, Aurelia approached a representative from one of the city's top logistics firms. He had ignored her proposal emails for 2 weeks. She reintroduced herself. He extended a hand, gave a firm shake, and said, "You're very articulate." She smiled without warmth. "I had to be. Nobody listens to silence." He laughed, uncomfortable. Before he could escape into a crowd of safer faces, she pressed forward. "I'd like to revisit our proposal. There's federal funding on the table. Your fleet could benefit, but I need your team's commitment." He blinked. "Well, our partnerships usually go through a vetting committee. And with all due respect, some of our boards are old school. They'll want to see more experience in international freight from your end." Her eyes didn't move. "I have 3 former FAA officials, a retired Air Force colonel, and a data team that beat your last 3 projections by 11%. If that's not enough, then let's not waste each other's time." He hesitated, then smiled tightly. "We'll be in touch." That meant no. Not yet. Maybe never. Aurelia walked out of that luncheon colder than when she entered. The glass elevator dropped her from the 14th floor to the lobby like a stone. And she knew, just as her grandmother had once known when denied a bank account because her handwriting looked too fancy, that sometimes the system doesn't slam the door in your face. It just makes sure the elevator always stops 1 floor too soon. That week, 3 different partners backed out of early investment discussions. Each cited risk concerns. One said, off the record, that they were unsure about the optics of Trinity Bay being led by someone who, quote, might be perceived as polarizing in certain markets. That was the thing about racism in modern boardrooms. It wore good cologne. It sent polite emails. And it always called its own discomfort strategy. Aurelia gathered her team. "I want every one of you to triple-check our numbers. They'll come for us through bureaucracy now. Licensing, zoning, FAA permits, watch for the slow leak, not the explosion." Her team nodded. They were loyal. Many were brilliant. But Aurelia knew that loyalty wasn't armor. Brilliance didn't prevent erasure. They'd worked so hard to build something efficient, ethical, expansive. But now the war would not be about building. It would be about undermining. The local press, once eager to profile Aurelia as a disruptor, now ran a piece questioning whether Trinity Bay's rapid rise was overleveraged. The journalist never reached out to her for comment. The op-ed was written by a retired executive who'd never once stepped foot in the new terminal. It quoted anonymous sources who feared the airport was moving too far, too fast. The next morning, Aurelia stood before her bathroom mirror, adjusting her collar. She looked tired, older, and yet she was sharper than ever. She remembered a line her uncle once said when she was little, watching her read Baldwin by the window. "They'll never hate you because you failed, baby. They'll hate you because you refused to fail where they expected you to." She carried that truth like a blade. By the end of the week, she was scheduled to meet the Department of Transportation. Another inspection. Another chance for the machine to flex its hidden claws. They would ask her questions they wouldn't dare ask the white men in the same field. She would answer each one. Clearly. Relentlessly. And then she would stand at the window of her office, stare at the long runways stretching into the distance, and remember that some people see a runway, and others only see a line you're not supposed to cross. There comes a point in every life shaped by resistance when the battle no longer feels like a battle, but a breath, a pattern, a quiet, grinding permanence. You wake, you suit up, and you brace yourself for the next delay, the next polite erasure, the next closed door with brass handles too cold to touch. Aurelia Stanton stood by the tinted window of her office on the top floor of the Trinity Bay Control Tower, watching a Gulfstream lift into the sky, its silver body rising against the purple horizon. It was evening, and her terminal lights flickered across the tarmac like stars that refused to blink. Down below, the world bustled in rhythm, baggage carts, blinking lights, air traffic rumble. Everything in motion. Everything except the system she'd spent a lifetime trying to outpace. That morning, the FAA had sent her a formal notice. A technical audit, they called it. Routine. But there was nothing routine about the questions they asked. Why was a maintenance report filed 2 hours late during a storm delay? Why was the lighting grid not upgraded sooner? Why hadn't she responded to a senator's inquiry within 48 hours? She had answers to them all. Meticulous, documented, undeniable. But she also had no illusions. The real question, the one whispered behind locked doors, was, how did she get here at all? How did a black woman go from South Memphis to owning the air above 12 runways in less than a decade? What they feared wasn't mismanagement. What they feared was proof. Proof that competence didn't come with a skin tone. Proof that authority could be elegant, unflinching, and female. Proof that the sky, long policed by white hands and whispered rules, could in fact belong to someone else. And that someone else didn't ask permission. Aurelia sat at the long walnut table in the boardroom at 3 p.m., surrounded by her legal counsel, her COO, and a quiet intern who clutched his notebook like scripture. Across from her sat 2 federal auditors, one black, one white, both dressed in the camouflage of neutrality. They asked their questions without inflection, as if their clipboard could mask the historical weight of their mission. But Aurelia could feel it, the tension beneath the table, the doubt sewn into their paperwork. "You're running a very ambitious operation here," the white auditor said. "I've never been accused of dreaming small," Aurelia replied. "It's important to stay within the lanes of federal aviation compliance," he added. She folded her hands. "Sir, I built the lane you're standing in." A silence stretched across the room like static. Outside the glass, a jet screamed down the runway, then lifted, disappeared, leaving only the thunder behind. Later that evening, Aurelia walked the terminal as she often did, incognito, no blazer, no name badge, just a woman among travelers. She passed a young black girl dragging a pink suitcase, her mother beside her, distracted by a gate change on her phone. The girl looked up, eyes wide. "Are you the lady who owns the airport?" she whispered. Aurelia knelt beside her and smiled. Only the parts they didn't give away. The girl didn't understand. But one day, she would. As Aurelia stood to go, she noticed a man watching her from a distance, a former colleague turned critic, now working for a rival firm. He didn't speak, just nodded. She returned it with grace. She had learned the difference between victory and visibility. One you win, the other you wear. By midnight, a call came in from Washington. The FAA had closed the audit. No violations. No apology. Of course not. Victory in her world never came with ceremony. It came like a breath you didn't realize you were holding. She hung up and looked again to the sky, that wild and stubborn thing above them all. It didn't care who built the towers. It didn't care who paid the fuel or filed the paperwork. The sky belonged to no one. But Aurelia had learned how to fly anyway.